Rich high society couple Anne and Bob Fredericks take a bike ride through a quiet neighborhood in France. As they pause to allow commuters to cross, Anne can't help but comment on how refreshing and romantic the ride is, but her husband doesn't feel the same, grumbling about exhaustion from riding the heavy bike. Anne quips that he may enjoy the ride more if he actually rode beside her and not behind her. Bob happens to think that's a splendid idea, mentioning it looks like rain anyways. Anne scoffs, fed up of his pessimism, and pedals on, leaving Bob behind. Though much to her dismay, the rain actually does start falling, and she's drenched by the time she returns home. Her hairstylist Jack tuts at her wet dog look, joking he's going to charge her double tonight, whilst her head maid Maria quickly brings her a towel to dry off. While getting her hair done, Maria hands Anne her mail, and a package that was delivered by hand for her. Anne skips over the mail, going straight to the package and its accompanying letter. Enclosed is an expensive gold necklace with a one-line letter that beckons Anne to wear it tonight. If she's pleased with it, signed with only initials. She smiles knowingly at the necklace. Maria supervises the Fredericks children, Sean and Rose, as they eat dinner. They're all surprised when Stephen, Bob's eldest son from his previous marriage, appears in the kitchen, warmly greeting Maria and the kids. Stephen's just got in this afternoon and wonders what all the buzz in the home is about, questioning if it's someone's birthday. Maria informs him it's a simple dinner party for 12 and Stephen rolls his eyes, having not missed the political pomp of high society gatherings. Stephen finds Bob fixing the display light for his Caravaggio painting of the Last Supper. Stephen is surprised he's willing to sell it, and Bob admits he doesn't have much of a choice left. He's hanging by a financial thread at the moment. Stephen wonders if Anne is truly costing him that much, suggesting he sell her jewels instead, but Bob doesn't find that humorous. Stephen offers to try and lend him something and Bob is all for it, until Stephen mentions asking his mom for the money. Bob wonders how his ex-wife is doing and Stephen admits she's getting older, fatter and richer by the day, exchanging stories on how her questionable political views haven't changed in the least. When the topic changes to how Stephen's doing, he admits that the writing has been a struggle lately. He's in a bit of a rut and his publisher is coming to Paris, even though they're fully aware Stephen doesn't have any material to submit. Helene Bernard checks on her husband Antoine as he does his regular swim. David Morgan is encouraged to take a Mektub fortune cookie by his Arabic Uber driver, and his fortune predicts he'll meet someone special tonight. David doesn't think it's very original, but the driver suggests the possibility of the someone special being a mysterious, beautiful lady. David smiles at that thought, chomping on the cookie. Anne has Bob zip her up as she passes him on the way to the dining room, to give a final check of the table settings. As she counts the seats, she finds 13 instead of her planned 12. As she wonders who could have done this, Stephen proudly admits he's the culprit, and Anne seems anything but happy to see him. She accuses Stephen of attempting to crash her party, but he insists Bob invited him, making some subtly insinuating remarks about the topic of golf and his father being a fast learner. Anne ignores him and orders Maria to add another place setting, refusing to have the seats stay at an unlucky number. Just as Maria's finalizing the additional place setting with some of the other maids, Anne bursts into the room, ordering the women to face her so she can appraise them. She intends to have one of the maids masquerade as a party guest tonight. She chooses Maria, and immediately Maria tries to refuse, insisting that maids don't have dinner with the bosses. Anne waves the comment away, claiming she's like family, and whisks her away to her dressing room. Anne starts scanning her closet for dresses that might fit Maria, though Maria, being the maid, is very aware she and Madame, as she refers to Anne, are not the same size. Maria keeps trying to suggest other maids, or reasons as to why she's unfit for the job, but for her every suggestion and self-deprecating comment, Anne has a reason why she won't accept anyone else, and a false compliment to make Maria feel better. Maria suggests Mandy. Anne has problems with her ethnicity and language skills. Maria mentions her accent and her weight. Anne insists her accent is charming, and while she's pear-shaped, she's not fat. Maria's anxiety about the situation only builds when Anne mentions they're going to lie about her identity. Maria couldn't lie to save her life, but Anne's firmly of the belief that all women can lie. It's just about smiling. Anne tries to convince Maria that one day, they'll look back at this moment and laugh, as she hands her over to Jacques to quickly style her hair. Bob greets Toby, the esteemed Lord Mayor of London, and his husband Michael before they're joined by Anne, who takes over the schmoozing. Bob slips away toward David, who whispers he has no news of the deal, but soothes Bob, reassuring him he's sure it'll be finalized by next week. Stephen scribbles a name tag for himself when he's interrupted by Toby, who mentions he's a fan of his previous book, having found the story of his father's hole-in-one and Anne firing the sexy girl cat is hilarious. Stephen's honored by Toby's compliment, admitting nothing's changed between Bob and Anne, comparing them to Punch and Judy. He congratulates Toby on his run as mayor, admitting he's done some fine work, and Toby jokingly hopes Stephen doesn't expose his family's every secret next. Jack tries to give Maria a pep talk before heading out, but she's still a ball of nerves. Stephen rejoins them in the dressing room to assist. David, Bob, and Antoine discuss the sale of the Caravaggio, with David asking Antoine how he intends to handle the press when it's publicly announced that it's changing hands. Antoine doesn't believe there's a rush, and Bob, trying to play it cool, agrees with him. David mentions the X-ray team are demanding another €10,000 for the authentication process, and Antoine offers to split this bill with him. But Bob's pride, and the lie he's telling, won't allow it. He claims he'd just like to visit the painting once in its new home, and Antoine reveals that once it's verified, it'll have pride of place in his museum. Anne returns to check on Maria, who's cowering behind the curtains, insisting this plan won't work. Stephen mentions that the Bernards, who have been here before, would have seen Maria, but Anne waves that possibility away. Nobody looks at the help. Besides, if they find her face familiar, Maria can simply claim they'd seen her at a fashion show. Finding that Maria still isn't dressed, Anne snaps at Jack and Stephen to sort her out. She gives Maria explicit instructions before she leaves. Don't smile too much, don't speak too much, and don't eat too much. Anne returns downstairs to find Bob in a suspiciously friendly conversation with a young blonde woman. Anne interrupts them, and Bob introduces her as his French teacher. Anne calls her by the wrong name, likely on purpose, and the young lady, Fanny, corrects her. Maria digs around in her closet for the only nice pair of heels she has, as she anxiously recaps Anne's rules. When she steps out into the living room, one of the maids, Josiane, smiles knowingly at her. Bob looks like he's gone into shock while Helene and the other guests scan every inch of her judgmentally, as they're all trying to appraise her. David immediately asks who she is, and Stephen spins a brilliantly structured lie in less than a second about how she claims she's Maria Escalante, but that her true identity is Maria Immaculata of the Two Sicilies, descendant of the revered princess of the House of Bourbon. The falsified backstory not only solidifies Maria's connection to old money and nobility, but also gives her plausible deniability should she accidentally be honest, and gives David a reason to keep his mouth shut about who she is without him knowing the truth. Maria nervously spins in front of the fireplace, unsure what to do with herself, when David approaches her, engaging in conversation about Caravaggio, wondering if she's a fan. Devout Christian Maria informs him she's a fan of the Holy Family, that she keeps a portrait of the baby Jesus by her bedside. David starts trying to guess which artist the portrait is by, El Greco, Goya, or Dali. Maria insists the artist doesn't matter, but the expression on the baby Christ's face and how much the love of the Holy Mother is expressed for him. Josiane pops in, informing them that dinner is served, and David mentions that tonight is a last supper of sorts for this painting, informing her that he's brokering its sale to Antoine. He takes the opportunity to introduce himself, but questions her when her introduction doesn't include a last name. Maria tries to be coy, claiming she's not brandishing her last name tonight, she's just here as a friend of a friend. The dinner begins, and Bob seems to notice something peculiar about the seating arrangement. Maria is sat to his right with Helene, and then Toby to his left. Meanwhile, Helene's husband is to the right of Anne, his wife. The chatter at the dinner table is full of pretentious, fast-moving satire and sarcasm, two masters of which are Toby and Bob. And as Helene sits in the middle of their conversation, she wonders if the fast-talking English speakers practice their witty back and forth. Toby jokes that it's harder to lie when you speak faster, and Helene retorts that must be why her husband speaks so slowly. Meanwhile, at the other end of the table, Antoine and Anne are engaged in a very flirtatious conversation, with Antoine suggesting that Anne and Bob visiting Paris will not rekindle the love in their relationship, and Anne's too smart to still believe that love truly lasts. He blatantly suggests adultery to her as a coping mechanism, telling her to make her husband a BFF and have lunch with him tomorrow. Mandy accidentally spills water on David as she tries to signal to Maria to check her makeup, and Maria impulsively takes the towel to pat him dry. Somewhat aggressively, the guests stare awkwardly at her cleavage while she does. David drags Maria into a conversation the guests are having about whether English people are funny, and she further embarrasses herself as she excitedly chatters about being a fan of Hugh Grant. Bob tries reining her in, but she goes on to comment about how David looks like Hugh Grant, leading the two into a mildly flirtatious conversation in front of the entire table. David dislikes the overly romantic films that Hugh tends to star in, and Maria comments that he shouldn't despise others, offering that people love happy endings where the hero chases after the girl and kisses her in the rain. Bob redirects the conversation again, and for a while, the attention is taken back off of Maria. David gets dragged into a vapid conversation with Jane Millerton, who goes on and on about the trials of staying sexy as a single mom, and starts whispering to Maria, begging her to talk to him again. He can't stand to listen to Jane. Maria tries resisting, but David continuously pursues her. He probes her on where she's from, and when she asks the same, David reveals he's from a small county called Down that his father owns most of. His father had hoped he'd get his desires to be an artist out of his system and return home to run the county, but David never achieved his dream of becoming an artist, so became a consultant instead. Bob pulls Maria aside, advising her not to drink too much and checking on how she's doing, sure she must be suffering. He tells her to not talk like a maid, just act unreasonable and unpleasant, in order to better fit into character. David is still being insistent on Maria talking to him, and announces to the entire table she's going to tell a joke. She tries to refuse multiple times, mentioning that the only joke she knows is adult, and hardly appropriate for the dinner table, but after more peer pressure from David and the other diners, she caves. She tells her rude joke and the other diners are entertained, all except Anne, who gives Maria a cutting look. Stephen tells Fanny he understands exactly why his father suddenly decided to pick up French, insinuating that they're sleeping together. Fanny tries to deny it, insisting Anne was the one who signed him up for French classes. Hearing that, Stephen understands, explaining to Fanny that she's the revenge, and Anne used to be Bob's golf teacher. Stephen asserts that he's going to marry her, though Fanny wonders what makes him think she'd say yes. Fanny tries to redirect the conversation, but Stephen's persistent when he's drunk, and he oscillates between flirting with her and threatening to out her. Bob side-eyes them from his corner of the table, not even noticing David's gone back to flirting with Maria. Stephen suddenly grabs the table's attention for a toast, and dragging Fanny to her feet, announces in front of all the guests that they're engaged, kissing her on the cheek. Maria, completely ignorant of what's going on, leads the table in applause. Anne tersely congratulates Stephen, inviting her guests to join her for dessert in the dining room, accompanied by a performance from child piano prodigy Jules Durand and his master, Fedor Krasinski. While the guests enjoy their after-dinner serenade, David looks around for Maria, who's in the back room with the maids laughing about the ordeals of the night, when they're interrupted by Anne. Anne scolds Maria for her performance tonight. Her only job was to hardly speak, but Anne reveals she heard her every conversation from the other side of the table, even the whispers. Maria thinks she did a good job at making the guests laugh, but Anne doesn't believe she can't tell the difference between people laughing with her and laughing at her. Anne warns Maria that if anyone were to find out about who she truly is, it'd be embarrassing not only for the Fredericks, but all parties involved. Anne stops Maria from rejoining the guests for dessert, sending her to bed for the night. Bob slaps Stephen awake after the party. He's completely plastered. He and Anne lift Stephen into a lounge chair to sleep in when he asks for Maria, slurring that she was the belle of the ball tonight. As they get ready for bed, Anne complains to Bob about how Stephen almost ruined the night, about Maria's embarrassing behavior, and David's odd obsession with her. Bob finds it humorous though, assuring her that everyone loved Maria, and that she has nothing to worry about, before he heads to bed. Anne checks her appearance in the mirror before crawling in beside him, but Bob's asleep by the time she gets there. Disappointed, Anne rolls over, turning the lights off. Stephen's woken by the sound of the landline ringing and answers it, half asleep. David's calling, and asks Stephen if he could get Maria's number for him, claiming he'd just like to invite her out for brunch. Stephen perks up, quickly heads over to the kitchen and asks Maria to write her number down on a piece of paper. Maria obliges, not questioning it, as Stephen promises to explain later. He gives David the number while heading back towards the lounge, where Bob supervises the packing of the Caravaggio for shipping. Stephen's about to excitedly announce what happened to him when they're interrupted by Anne. Anne inquires how Bob's French lessons are going, and when he demonstrates that he hasn't improved a bit, she makes it clear she's aware he's not learning French for her sake anymore. Just as she scolds Sean for playing on Maria's phone, she gets a text from David asking her out, which the boy goes on to read aloud. Maria thinks it's a wrong number, as nobody ever texts her, but Stephen snatches the phone excitedly, sending David a favorable reply before anyone can say anything. Anne snatches the phone from him in utter disbelief. She blames Stephen and Bob for this, but Stephen credits Maria's fantastic performance, while Bob finds it humorous. Anne grills Maria on if anything specific happened at the dinner. Had she said something? Did he play footsie with her? Or did they touch each other? Anne can't fathom David's attraction to Maria, wondering what this is all about. Maria admits she felt something when David looked at her, but Anne dismisses that as her being drunk. She snatches Maria's phone again, volunteering to turn him down on her behalf, but it backfires, only making David insist more. Anne thinks David is one of those who are turned on by a woman's resistance, assuming David wants a sexual relationship with her. When his next text invites her to the George V at 9 p.m., Maria assumes he's talking about the movie theater, but Anne's sure he means the hotel. Anne confesses to Bob she doesn't trust Maria, and wants to tell David the truth immediately, but Bob insists she wait until after the sale of the painting is finalized, not wanting his associates to think they're a house of liars. Maria searches Anne's closet for an outfit for her date. Maria meets David outside the cinema for their date. David reveals that he's just as much of a cheesy romantic as Maria is, taking her to a horror movie so that he can comfort her when she's scared. When Maria reveals Anne thought he meant a hotel, David laughs, mentioning Anne doesn't know the first thing about romance. He confesses to Maria that he knows who she truly is, but this is the beginning of a gross communication, because David's referring to the made-up identity that Stephen invented, while Maria thinks he's talking about her life as a maid. David confesses having feelings for Maria, regardless of who she is or her circumstances. Maria mentions she has a daughter as well, but David isn't deterred, considering the case closed. Anne goes on a romantic date with Antoine, flirting with him in broad daylight. Maria video calls her daughter as she practices her figure skating, mentioning to her that she's never been happier in her life. Anne returns home from her date to find Maria's not home. She asks to go out and Bob allowed her. Anne interrogates him on what Maria looked like when she was going out, if she wore makeup or a skirt. Bob doesn't understand the line of questioning, and Anne admits she thinks David and Maria are seeing each other, noting Maria arrived late and looked disheveled this morning. Anne and Bob head into the car, following David and Maria to their date spot. Anne is absolutely beside herself as she watches the couple, still flabbergasted at what David could possibly see in Maria, that he would take her to one of the most expensive restaurants in Paris. Bob thinks she's overreacting, and she can just fire Maria tomorrow, but Anne doesn't think it's as simple as that. Maria's worked for them for years and runs the house like clockwork. She's irreplaceable. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, David and Maria's date is going swimmingly. Their flirting has become more brazen and overt, with their conversation suggesting the couple have already copulated. Bob wonders why Anne's so fixated on them. She reveals she considers it her own little catastrophe, because Maria knows and has witnessed all the Fredericks' dirty laundry, figuratively and literally. David offers Maria a pair of expensive earrings as a gift. Anne considers telling him the truth again, but Bob insists she doesn't muddy the waters of his art deal, not wanting David to think they are poking fun at him. Anne wonders what the harm is. It's not like they have money problems, right? Bob lies that everything is fine, and that it's mostly because of Antoine's insistence upon owning a Caravaggio. Anne gets a return call from her psychiatrist, Dr. Schweiman, late at night. She rants to the doctor, complaining that she had to fight for everything in her life, including men, and doesn't understand how a lowly maid can inspire such feelings. Anne even complains she feels so alone, even in a crowded room, and Bob, who's awake and right next to her, is in disbelief. David asks Maria what her secret dream is one night while in bed. Maria's mostly given up on dreams, claiming she's a woman of simple desires now. But Dave insists everyone has one personal project they'd like to work on. He wants to know what hers is. Maria thinks it'll sound silly to him, but admits she wants to invent the half pack of baking powder, explaining she's often found while cooking that most recipes only call for half the pack, so the other half stays in the cupboard and never gets used. It usually gets thrown out, and a whole fresh pack is opened, repeating the wasteful cycle again. David compliments the idea, suggesting perhaps Maria could cook for him sometime at her place, offering to appraise her Velázquez painting, or she could take him to Madrid to meet her family. Anne dresses up like a maid and tries to wake Bob, in an attempt to seduce him. He's wowed by the outfit, and Anne reveals Dr. Schweiman suggested it as a way for her to expunge her anger against Maria. Bob wonders if she's jealous, but Anne immediately recoils at the suggestion. Bob assures her she's beautiful, but he didn't marry her for her looks, surmising that she's jealous because she's insecure. Anne admits that of course she's insecure, they're never physically intimate anymore, and the world, especially Paris, is filled with pretty young women. Bob assuages her, reminding her they have doctor's orders tonight. He strips his shirt off like a young stallion. Suddenly his phone rings. Checking the caller ID, he insists he needs to answer, taking the call in the other room. Anne sighs, wiping a single tear from the corner of her eye before it has the chance to fall. Bob's lawyer informs him they desperately need the money from the painting, and they only have a month before foreclosure begins. Maria bumps into a maid on her way out of the hotel after her hookup with David, and it's like staring her true self in the face. Maria arrives at work, startled by Anne, who's awake uncharacteristically early this morning. She asks Maria what's in the bag she's carrying, but Maria flubs her lies. Anne demands she hand over the bag and Maria does so, reluctant and protesting the entire time. And she tries to make excuses, but Anne takes one look in the bag and she can smell Maria's cheap, vanilla perfume all over the dress. Anne harshly chastises Maria for her dishonesty, wondering if she steals her panties to wear on dates too. Anne trusted her when she sat her at that table, and she betrayed that. Maria begins crying, trying to apologize. She claims she doesn't know what came over her, and that she's in love, but Anne won't hear it, having no pity for tears. She orders Maria pull herself together and put an end to it, reminding her to think of her daughter, whose education Anne would simply hate to have to stop funding. Maria obsessively checks her phone for texts from David, and Mandy advises her to get over it. David won't call, because they don't belong in the same world. Mandy doesn't believe people like them fall in love with people like her and Maria, thinking they consider them no better than slaves. But Maria argues she's worth just as much as Anne. Even if she serves her tea on a tray, she's a human being. Stephen listens carefully to the conversation as he double-checks his draft for his new novel, titled The Maid. Maria continues her daily routine, anxiously waiting to hear from David while the Fredericks continue their affairs, Anne with Antoine, and Bob with Fanny. Helene notices her husband's continued absence. Sean's birthday comes around, and Anne's invited a renowned psychic to entertain the moms. As Maria walks by, the psychic channels a message that one of the group is worried, and assures them their person is going to call and ask them away for the weekend. She advises them they should say yes and go enjoy life while they can. It's not always been easy for them in the past, and may not be in future. The women wonder which one of them the message is for, but the psychic claims the woman it's for knows exactly who she is. Maria interrupts to ask Anne if they should open the presents, and Anne snatches the cell phone from her bosom, wondering if Maria is drunk. As Maria cleans up the aftermath of the birthday party, her phone goes off with a message from David. David takes Maria for a scenic drive out to the countryside. Antoine and Bob are hunting in the fields together when Bob spots the approaching car through his scope, noting Maria's with him. David parks the car, and the two are about to head into the property when Maria notices Anne's there, along with the children and Helene. She tries to subtly convince David they should leave, mentioning that if he knows her, he should know she can't mix with those people. David thinks she's talking about nobility mixing with non-nobles, and assures her everything will be fine. It's the 21st century after all. With that, he drags her out and she's immediately called out to by the children, which Anne hears too, of course. The group lounge at the pool, with Antoine making a toast to celebrate the sale of the Caravaggio, and the group's loving relationships to their wives. Helene makes a subtle remark about Caravaggio being an adulterer, and soon the conversation snowballs into stereotypical sexual deviances amongst different Westerners. Bob claims the Irish know nothing of romance, they're simply happy drunks, while the French specialize in adultery and the English do spanky-spanky. Antoine can't help but join in with his own reasoning for these differences. The French are adulterous to stay married to their wives, and the English are only brave enough to talk to one girl after spending most of their lives repressing their sexualities. When asked what she thinks, Maria confesses she's an old-fashioned Spanish, and believes marriage is important. Anne subtly probes Maria, wondering if she doesn't lie at all. David inquires how Anne and Maria met, and Bob covers for them, making it seem like the two are secretive about their friendship. Maria plainly confesses to everyone that she's their maid and has been working for them for over 10 years, but Anne quickly forces a laugh, trying to make it seem like it was a joke, and inventing a story about them meeting when they were young and traveling together, quickly changing the subject. Helene asks when they'll be heading back to New York, and Anne reveals that it'll be soon. As Bob has business to handle, Maria's surprised, as this is the first she's heard of this. Anne confronts Maria before she leaves, blaming her for putting them in a precarious and possibly embarrassing situation. Maria insists it's not what she thinks, that David truly loves her, and that she never asks him for anything. Maria tries begging, but Anne reiterates she asked her kindness once. Maria argues she only did what Anne asked of her. Anne admits she doesn't want to hurt her, but this is not Maria's world, informing her that if her opinions were of any impact or interest, why would she be nothing but a maid? Maria ignores her arguments, insisting again that David loves her, and perhaps Anne should believe in love too. Anne tries seducing Antoine that night, heading to the pool completely. But by the time she surfaces, Antoine's gotten out of the pool, ignoring her like she isn't even there. Maria sings during work, and Mandy notes how in love she is. She sings all the time and barely eats. Stephen's greeted by his publicist, who compliments his latest draft, wondering if the story's true. Stephen confirms it is, just like last time, only this time, instead of Anne and his dad, it's Anne and the maid. Anne casually bumps into David on the street one day, and mentions to him she's just looking for a gentleman for a double date with her friend Jane, subtly hinting that she's freshly divorced, and wondering what to do with all her millions. David jokes Anne must be taking him for some sort of gigolo, and while Anne admits she's heard of his other talents, she insists she'll get the details from Jane. Anne pretends to be startled to hear David mention Maria, and asks him to keep it between them, as she doesn't want anyone to be embarrassed, but we don't hear exactly what she tells David. When she bids him goodbye, David looks crushed, and as she walks away, she twists her ankle trying to dodge a motorcycle. Instant karma. Bob patches up Anne's ankle for her. Maria waits on a call or text from David, but it never comes. She sends multiple messages and tries calling him, but it goes straight to voicemail. Maria starts worrying that David was in an accident, and Josiane reveals that only accidents with make men suddenly stop calling. Maria doesn't want to believe that, attached to how in love David appeared to be with her. Anne limps through the place she used to visit with Antoine, also looking for traces of a man who made her feel wanted, just like Maria. Bob continues his French lessons with Fanny, and while his accent doesn't improve, their relationship does, evident by Bob kissing her in public. Anne reassures Maria she can sense her embarrassment over everything that's happened, but despite all that, Maria is still important to this household, announcing they intend to give her a raise for Christmas. Maria could care less about the raise. Anne asks her to bring tea to the salon for two, and when she enters, she finds David seated with Anne, having a meeting. David doesn't look up or so much as acknowledge Maria's existence as she serves them. His blatant disregard shatters Maria's heart. Maria packs her things immediately, leaving behind her apron and the earrings David gave her. She says goodbye to no one except Steven, who she passes picking up papers in the yard. Steven understands without her explaining, and hugs Maria goodbye. David joins Steven on the stairs, asking him if he's found his ending, and Steven admits he's not sure. David gives him some advice he got from a woman he was fond of once, telling Steven people love happy endings. The hero runs, he kisses her in the rain, that sort of thing. Steven smiles at that, but as Maria walks through the streets of Paris, tears in her eyes, no one runs after her. Maria walks alone, headed towards the next chapter of her story.